I'm Joe Silva, co-founder and CEO of Spektion. We do runtime vulnerability management. On today with me is Kyle Bubp, friend, former colleague, and CISO of Avid. I'll let you. Did I cover it all, or are there
Yep,
more
that's
highlights
it.
for you?
That's all I am. Just a CISO. I have
All
nothing
right.
else going on in my life. It consumes me. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for inviting me to this. The topic of vulnerability management is very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
I say that somewhat in jest, but honestly, it's something that I've dealt with a lot in my career. I mean, I've done it for, I don't know, since EI Retina was a thing, back when I was working with the DoD. So I have
Like,
plenty of experience, and you know what? The sad thing is, vulnerability management really hasn't changed in those last 20 or so years.
well, listen, this isn't this session here is not like a pitch for Spection, but honestly, like that's what we recognized. Um, I mean, even within a few years, you could see like other technologies on the IAM and threat side, like dramatically like transform in terms of like the focus on being more comprehensive, being more real time. Vulnerability management is like stuck in like the like year 2000, like of like signature based AV. So
It is, and you can probably cut this part out. I don't know how much you want to keep to the webinar questions,
I
but
don't care. Yeah, we're good
okay,
to go.
cool. All
We'll
right.
freestyle it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you're largely reliant on CISA and the National Vulnerability Database, and that gets populated by, it's just opportunistic, right? You have researchers, whether it be at CISA or other governments, or you have, Microsoft or Google's Project Zero, or you have just independent researchers. um, but it's an opportunistic database of things that people find interesting, and sometimes there's a threat. But then I mean, I'm sure you've seen this where people, like, their main goal in their security career is to get a CVE published, and then they're like, great, which is fine. Like, that's great. Now that we know of a vulnerability in a product, but I think the question that most people want to answer is, okay, so what? And I think, much of the security industry is built on this idea of vulnerability management being the foundation of your security program, where we're looking at CVSS scores, and we've got red flags and orange flags and green flags. Just tell everyone how well we're doing, right?
Yeah, well, like
But what we don't capture from my perspective is the context. Like, tell me why this matters. Don't just tell me it's above a CVSS 7. Okay, what does that mean?
here's what's so crazy to me is like you said, vulnerability management is considered such a foundational control, and it's based on the CVE system, which is like a crowdsourced effort, like that's comprised of like varying motivations. Like you said, for some, it's like an egocentric thing, right? And it's a feather in the cap to get a CVE. For others, it's like genuinely altruistic. That's great, right? There's a lot of like security researchers and organizations that are really acting out of best interest of like the community. Um, and then for others, like it's essentially like companies are compelled, right? Because somebody has said, hey, you've got N amount of time to disclose this, or it's already being breached, in which case the CVE is probably of little value because the biggest material impact of organization is like the 0 day or 1 day exploitation of the vulnerability. And like that's before, you know, the very like shaky funding of the CVE ecosystem even came to the forefront. It was like bursting at the seams and insufficient before then. But then with the new administration and the CISA funding issue, I think it really kind of came into the fore. But like nonetheless, this is the basis of how we understand our susceptibility to attacks. And there's like I should probably amend what I said because like when I look at like new technology, I would say where there's new attack surfaces, cloud and containers, we're seeing new technologies that they're, still heavily CVE reliant, but also, a lot more on like configuration based vulnerabilities that wouldn't be captured in
Absolutely.
CVEs and other like vulnerable conditions with regards to how like the cloud is administered. But when I look at, let's just say, like laptops and servers, legacy attack surface, which I saw like the DBIR, and I'm assuming this is heavily driven by MOVEit, which we're
Are you
first, we're
referencing
first, we're first hand,
how the
we're first hand
DBIR
know.
is basically saying, the
Number two
vulnerability
cause of
exploit?
breach. Yeah,
Yeah. So
software.
there's a footnote. There's a footnote that basically is exactly what you're saying. It's all driven by that MOVEit vulnerability. So it's
Yeah,
not like thousands of vulnerabilities were exploited last year.
right.
It's a very small handful.
Well, here's what I wonder. So with Spection, we see all of these exploitable conditions in software at runtime, right? Software that's executing and in use and heavily exploitable conditions. And some of them like quite trivially, right? So like our team, a lot of them are former red teamers, so they'll build a POC on the side after we see it in a customer environment. And a lot of times you never see a CVE, and then there's a new version of the software, and that condition is gone, right? So, the vendor saw it, they fixed it. But like, do you really think that that condition that our engineers who have a full-time job, like 20 hours a day, building a product at a startup, just on the side build a POC for this? The idea that they're the only ones who are doing that,
Right. Yeah, I think,
and that it was never exploited, but so there's never a CVE, and it just gets fixed in
well,
an update. That happens all the time.
yeah, and like what you're talking about kind of goes back to your comment about the altruistic nature of publishing CVEs, right? I mean, if you were an adversary, you're not going to go to like NIST and say, hey, by the way, I found this vulnerability that I can exploit and I have working exploit code for. So it's not only opportunistic, but the motivation has to be there from a defender's perspective. And then if you go and you talk to any SOC, and you ask them, hey, what percentage of our alerts are coming from exploitation attempts? The number is very low. Like, so what are we doing here with, like, we're basing our entire security program on a database of vulnerabilities that probably can't be exploited. And yet we're running around and like the boy who cried wolf and saying our security posture is broken when it's really just a function of patch management at the end of the day. For legacy vulnerability management programs, it's really just patch management, right? Like what you're talking about, when I think about vulnerability management and today, and most companies are cloud native. They're not running VMs in the cloud, or they shouldn't be if they're born in the cloud. We know that's a struggle too. A little lift and shift here and there. But so these traditional ways of thinking about vulnerability management and scanning or deploying agents, like it doesn't work. Where are you going to deploy your agent on? A serverless function? Are you going to bake it into a container image? Like, no, you got to, part of the majority of the risk is configuration. And then it's these unknowns in software that we're just not testing for, or CISA hasn't gotten around to yet, or Google or Microsoft or whoever, they just haven't published it. So there's this whole treasure trove, I would say, of like risk that's just sitting out there unbeknownst to the people who are running the software. And I mean, even I would say, security software vendors, they're not pushing software to have like secure software. They're pushing software to sell. So
Yeah.
there are security vulnerabilities even in security software.
Well, when you see a security vulnerability in security software, here's what the security vendors say. Oh, well, that's just normal because we need such broad-based access to everything. That's not actually a vulnerable condition. That's just necessary for us to be able to secure the system.
Right.
We need access to like LSAS process memory, and that's not actually insecure memory management in the application. That's just because we need to be on top of everything and monitoring everything for you.
Yeah, I mean they'll all say that, right? Like I remember, I don't know, it was probably early on in my career when I was deploying some backup management software, and they said they needed domain admin. I'm like, hold on a second, you don't need domain admin. Tell me what permissions you need. And it was a fact-finding exercise because, like most vendors, they just want to sell the software. They need an easy button. It has to be easy to deploy. So just give it full admin, which
Well,
then I think to your point opens you up to a ton of risk. Can't say a ton, but
It's all right. You can,
we'll
I'll
cut
bleep
that
it
out.
out. Yeah,
But then it opens you up to risk. So you're trusting in a vendor, and the way that they have to deploy their software makes you more vulnerable. And that's just from the identity perspective. We're not even talking about how they've actually built the software. Maybe they rely on insecure libraries or things that you haven't even uncovered yet.
well, like here's what I think is one of the things that's like fundamentally broken around vulnerability management is that nobody actually looks at the level of privilege software needs to run at as like a component of the overall risk equation for it, which is odd to me, right? Like, hey, this software is running as domain admin. Okay, probably slightly larger blast radius if it's exploited than the software that's just running as user mode on a workstation. Um, and some of that just goes back to how I think like just I was going to say legacy vulnerability management, but they're really current state vulnerability management tools, Ron.
Yeah, we have never moved past legacy.
Yeah,
We're
it's
doing it the same way, right? We're scanning,
mm,
we're compiling all these vulnerabilities, and we're saying, is it critical? Is it high? Is it medium? And then
like
we're going to report it. And we hope enough nagging fixes the problem.
so, what I don't want to do is I don't want to just badmouth tools because honestly, I could say that maybe like, there's a ton of investment in cybersecurity. And so I would say like a large part, like the tools that exist are a function of like the demand,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, I
Uh,
think I'm not. Yeah, maybe I'm coming off as bad mouthing the
no,
tools,
no, it's
but
not. It's just like, the tools, the data they're built on, it's insufficient for sure.
well, I
Um,
think it's all we have right now, right?
yeah.
Like, if you ask me to go build a brand new vulnerability management program, how do I build that without the current tools that exist? Whether it be a network-based scanner, whether it be an agent, something
Yeah.
has to give me that initial data, and then I can build upon that data with context. So, like what we were talking about with identity as a context, data classification as a context, network paths or network exposure. Does an exploit exist? All of that context has to then get layered on top. I think when I think about traditional vulnerability management, it really is just fire off the scan, look at the criticality that the scanner is telling me, and then that's how I prioritize. But the reality is it's much more nuanced than that. And even I would argue that even some of the scores are just wrong. I mean, just based on some of the ways in which you would have to gain access to exploit the vulnerability. And I can give an example. So there was a BIOS vulnerability that you had to have physical local access to the
Yeah.
machine to exploit, and the CVSS score was in the critical range. And I mean, any security practitioner knows if you have local access, you own the machine regardless of any
What does it
vulnerability.
matter? Yes.
Right. I think maybe that's what's missing. And when we talk about traditional vulnerability management, it's just the layering on the context. And it's not just about the CVSS score. That's your starting point, I think.
Well, like you touched on something with it's just the scans, right? Hey, here's the scans, here's the results. And I think that like vulnerability management, sometimes it's a compliance function, and sometimes it's a risk-based function. But hey, are you doing these scan things that I would say are necessary? Authenticated scanning, right? Having full coverage of all your assets necessary. But I think sometimes organizations that are pursuing that and just doing what's necessary but not sufficient achieves the compliance goals, sometimes it's seen as done, right? So most compliance work and security is necessary, but it's not sufficient to have risk management appropriate for the organization. But I think that's where it just stops. And then it's like anything beyond that is extraneous. And I'll just go back to what I said, where why don't we see better tools? I think the demand's not there. There's just like a lack of imagination in terms of what's possible. You talk to people on the blue team side, on the threat hunt side, they've always got new ideas for what they'd like to see from technologies be able to detect and analyze. On the vuln management side, I think the lack of imagination is because it's just such drudgery that people can't even imagine anything outside the confines of what existing technologies can deliver.
Yeah, and I think I'm probably like preaching to the choir, but if you're building a security program just to satisfy a compliance framework, then you're really not building a security program. You're just checking a compliance box. So in that scenario, if you're doing vulnerability scans and you're reporting on it, and that's the end of your road, then yeah, you can check the box. But are you doing it well? Absolutely not. And I think that's where, like you were talking about, like threat hunters and um, even people that are just passionate about security that are within your team, they're going to want to do more. They're going to realize once they've published that report about vulnerabilities of 3 or 6 times in a row and nothing's changing, they're going to think to themselves, "Hey, there's got to be a better way. What are we really like? What is the effect I'm really having in the organization if every month my number never changes?" like and then I would also question, is there really a risk here? Because if the number never changes and we don't get compromised, and I'm told in security, you've always heard this, it's not a matter of if but when. Well, when is it coming? Because
Right.
the risk stays the same, but nothing really happens. So, you know,
Well, my like Josh, my co-founder, he likes to say that most vulnerability management programs are about taking a big number and turning it into a smaller number, right? And that
yeah,
ends up informing anything. It shouldn't be that way, but ultimately that's what the program gets measured on, which is why the organizational like politics of vulnerability management are just so brutal. That's actually what grinds people down the most,
you mean
right?
the burn down of missing patches or something like that?
Yeah. When
Like
you're
when I
like, you're
so
going to your
my
peer and desktop, right? And saying,
yeah
hey, can you go ahead and do this thing that I think is already your job, but you're saying you're not able to do, probably for legit reasons relative to resourcing and like sphere of control. It's
yeah
miserable. That's what I think burns so many people out.
I would agree. When you first said that, when you first said burning, like making a big problem or a big number a small number, my thought initially was that context I was talking about earlier, where it's not just go patch every critical vulnerability, it's focus on these
Yeah.
by which we think will ultimately lead to compromise. But yeah, what you're talking about, that scenario of just chasing, like your job is the janitor that you can't actually clean up the vomit on the floor. You have to go tell all the kids that they have to go clean it up or else. And it's like, or else what though?
Right. Well, and even like you said, you can turn the big number into a small number in two ways, right? Hatching faster than you accrue or prioritizing in a way where some of these vulnerabilities you just set aside, right? You risk accept it or you downgrade the prioritization. You downgrade the patching prioritization, the environment. But at a certain point, and I know we've worked at organizations that have been pretty large like technology footprints and pretty substantial tech debt, which is most companies that are more than 20 years old, right? Um, and you get to a point where it doesn't matter. You can layer in EPSS, you can layer in all the threat intel. Then you have compliance burdens, whether you're regulated or you're essentially transitively regulated by your third parties who are regulated. And you get to a point where the number that you've prioritized down to still exceeds the capacity of the technology teams
Right.
to fix. And then it's like, from a triage perspective, hey, I'm a paramedic. What do I prioritize? The gunshot wound to the stomach or the stab wound to the liver, right?
Yes.
Like that's pretty much where
Well, I
I've
think
always found myself.
like, yeah, those two things don't really operate in parallel, meaning you have compliance frameworks that say you can't have any number of critical or high vulnerabilities outside of SLA, but you want to build a sophisticated vulnerability management program, but you can't because you're always going to be bound back to this compliance framework that doesn't align with the context-based vulnerability management program that you want to build. And so even companies that want to be more mature and more focused and more prioritized, they can't, because they still have to do this thing to either satisfy some compliance framework or even satisfy their customers that are sending them, third-party risk assessments or questionnaires. And I think that's like fundamentally with the industry, that's where it's broken. Because
The risk
until
assessments and the vendor questionnaires is the biggest security theater I've maybe ever dealt with. Right.
well,
I can't tell
I
you how
mean,
many times I've been
you know,
involved with breaches of third-party software where the vendor risk assessment came back perfect.
I'm sure they were like SOC 2 compliant as well.
Dude, SOC 2 compliance is essentially like a shield that will protect you from everything. I think I've mostly every breach event that I've been involved in where there was some vendor component, right? Whether it was SaaS, installed software, or something else, I'm pretty sure their compliance was on point.
Yeah, which should illustrate what we were talking about earlier. It's like, yeah, you can meet a compliance framework. Does that mean you have a good security program? Absolutely not.
Oh, listen, I'm listening to this conversation in my head, and I'm realizing how dark and depressing it is, which is why people in vulnerability management typically look for other jobs for their mental health. Um, only at least only the super mentally strong survive in this job. So maybe we should talk about like what do we think can be done better, right? So I mean, you're like pretty new in your job, right? And then every organization's different in terms of like what the risk appetite is, kind of, what the budgeting is, and what the appetite for like the friction that security is going to cause is. But like when you think about building a vulnerability management program from scratch or essentially just rebuilding it, maybe like what comes to mind as like things that you would do that maybe wouldn't have done a few years ago, but now you would do.
Uh, yeah, first, I think this idea of removing the onus of security responsibility from the people that are responsible for maintaining the systems and the code, that's got to stop. Um, so, I mean, currently, right now, what I'm digging into is not where we have gaps in our vulnerability reporting. It's where do we have gaps in our patch management? Where do we have gaps in our asset management? You know, why do these gaps exist and how quickly can we close them? Because ultimately, the server admins own the risk for the servers. The workstation admins own the risk for the workstations. So don't throw it over the wall and say, just tell me which vulnerabilities to patch. No, it's you're patching everything all the time. So I think removing that responsibility is kind of where we've messed up a little bit. Is saying, oh, I have a vulnerability management team. Oh, I have an application security team. I have a security team in general that's going to tell me what to do, instead of not only do I own the availability, I also own the security of this asset. So that's one thing. Um, but when I think about vulnerability management, I'm not going to pursue that model of everything that's critical or high or medium critical or high. It's all the highest priority. It's because we know it's not. Like we have enough evidence, having done this for decades, that we know not every critical vulnerability is critical. Where I struggle is, do I have enough data and context to be able to, I guess, say with confidence that we can set these criticals aside because the likelihood of exploitation is so low, um, that we can focus on only this handful. And then it really gets into configuration management, hardening the configuration, because I have to account for not only just a vulnerability with exploit code, but the vulnerabilities that exist that haven't been published, that we know are out there, right? Like shitty software is out there. You know it's being sold. You know it's being installed. You know the adversaries probably know the way in, but you don't know about it because you're essentially reliant on the national vulnerability database that doesn't know about it. So now our vendors don't have signatures for it. So I have to think about, all right, our identity controls, are they hardened? Are our configurations hardened? Um, man, there's just a myriad of things just outside of a patch that I have to worry about when I truly think about how a vulnerability is exploited, including unknown vulnerabilities. It's not just about a patch. Like that's the easy button, and that's the easy button for the things that we know about. I guess my goal is to complicate exploitation and lateral movement as much as I possibly can. So I'd like to be able to say, if a workstation gets compromised, I don't care, because I know that my security controls are so strong and it would be so improbable that I can just wipe it and re-image it and be done with it. I don't even care because I'm not worried. I'm not there yet. That's kind of where I think about, vulnerability management is just a piece of it, I guess the CVE is just one piece of vulnerability management. There's all the additional context that I was talking about earlier as well.
So I can learn a lot about the quality of a company's security program, not just the security organization, but the overall security program, by asking, who is the primary target of a patch management audit? When it's security, it's a bad sign, right?
Yes.
When it's the technology, when it's, a lot of times it may have to be the CIO and the CTO if those are separate roles. But what I've seen is too frequently, it's just easy to make security the primary POC for a patch management audit, even though security rarely if ever patches, nor do you want them to. But it's just easy because it's a single throat to choke, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a proper security model, the security practitioners don't have the access to make changes on systems because we are the ones that are advising on the risk. And so if we can go change that risk, I mean, it's like a conflict of interest. So the security team should never be asked why is patch management broken? I don't know. I don't. That's not my. I don't own that process. You tell me.
Right. I mean, I inform them. I provide all the context I can in terms of intelligence around the vulnerability. You certainly can't understand the asset criticality more than the asset owner or maintainer, although you may be expected to.
Well, there is that,
Right.
but
Right.
everyone has unrealistic expectations. It's a matter of where.
I mean, I just go ahead and assume like high fidelity contextualized inventory is totally impractical. Everybody wants it, but I've yet to be at an organization that really has it comprehensively. So you just have to go in assuming like inventory. You'll maybe know an asset exists, but what exactly it does and what else it's connected to, probably just go ahead and assume. You have to have a tolerance for that ambiguity, I think, in your security program. But going back to what you said around like having a very multifaceted view of vulnerability risk, right? That's not just based on a CVE. Like, do you feel like there's data points that you don't have, or maybe you have, but aren't sufficiently accessible enough that would make that easier? Because you said like there's a lot of additional context around vulnerabilities rather than just the CVSS score.
Yeah, I think understanding what any given piece of software is actually doing in my environment. You have software that the business needs to run, and then if you're lucky, somebody finds a vulnerability and they publish it and they'll tell you how to remediate it. But that doesn't really give me the full scope of the risk of that piece of software. Because like I was talking about earlier in the call, if I were to take the vendor's recommendation and just give this piece of software domain admin, well, now this thing has complete access to my entire network. It's what every pen tester tries to get access to is domain admin, and I've just given it to this thing that all I wanted to do is write data to a tape. We had tapes back then, LTO3, baby.
Wow, man, you look too young to know that, but
I started young. I've always been passionate about security
from a very young age.
Yeah, but anyway, like, so I think the over reliance on the NVD and just simply narrowing vulnerability management down to just patch, and sometimes there's a registry key, but largely it's just patch. I
Yeah.
think that's a very naive way to think about the impact of all of these programs and packages and applications that are running in your environment. Because I mean, like, if you were to ask someone, yeah, you could ask me, Kyle, CISO, do you know every application that's required by your business that has elevated privileges? I have no idea. I wish I knew. That would be really helpful for me, but I don't know. I would gather. I would assume that most CISOs have no idea, and even the ones that are closer to the technology, like talk about your vulnerability management analysts. You know, even maybe these, like, to stay on the topic of a backup program, even the person that runs the backups, do they know? Probably not. And so I think having that additional insight around, okay, outside of the very topical, is there a CVE, yes or no? What else is this thing capable of doing in my environment? That would be helpful for me to contextualize and prioritize where we need to not only patch, because that's like, you know, if there even is a patch, but okay, how do we take some of those other security best practices, like the principle of least privilege and network segmentation and encryption, all those things that we talk about as security practitioners, where I can say, okay, these things, while we need them for the business to operate, they are very risky. And so we want to put controls around this to make sure that not even from an adversary perspective, but like, even if maybe the person that's operating it just doesn't know what they're doing and they break something, we just need to have those controls in place to limit our risk. I think that would be helpful for me.
Well, it's funny, like all the things you're pointing out, like the only time they surface typically are a breach
Yep.
and an after action or a red team report, which typically gets read with like high interest, at a level in the business that like most security reporting doesn't get read, right? It's almost like salacious to read it, right? And people are like, oh, why didn't we know this? The problem is it's like really useful information, but it's very anecdotal, right? It's not at scale, it's not continuous. Um, and but you learn all these things in a red team report that are very interesting about, yeah, hey, here's the actual level of privilege this software was executing at, right? Here are all the other things this like service account had access to. Um, here's the here are like here's like the encryption protocols and like the certificate checking that wasn't happening with this software and why it was so easy to exploit.
The service account had a password that was on a known breach list, or it was like, SQL admin 123.
Right.
Like, all of this additional context that would be extremely helpful to
Yep.
mitigate risk in an environment that's so far away from just a CVE.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of it's like it's behavior based. And so it's going to be in the context of like the organization. Some of it is just very insecure, exploitable behavior that I don't want to say is endemic in software, but is way more present than it should be or than manifests in CVEs. Um, me, can I ask this, and maybe this will be the last question, but here's something I can't
I
figure
hope it's
out.
not the last question, Joe.
Well, I want to let you expound. I know you got a lot of wisdom. I want to let you dump it all
Okay,
out.
okay.
Or maybe we'll titrate it over separate sessions. But um, you know, just like over the course like the last 10 years, we've seen like more emphasis on AppSec than ever, right? From software providers. Like in terms of, good Lord, I can't imagine the AppSec tool market being any larger, but I'm sure it will be, right? Like, so we've never seen more AppSec tools in the market. We've never seen, honestly, greater adoption of AppSec tools to include even the developer community, right? Security aside, just the developer community adopting AppSec tools. I've never seen more kind of contractual, security and compliance obligations tied to like vendor AppSec. And yet, the velocity of CVEs, which we've already said we know as a system isn't capturing everything, yet the velocity of CVEs and software is only increasing. What does that mean?
I have no idea. I mean, yeah, that's a great point.
Like, I
Yeah,
mean, is
what
it
does
is it
that
like
mean?
is it like software providers are just ignoring more known risk than ever before they release software?
Or is it
That's
that
one
these,
interpretation of the data. I'm not saying that's the
or is it
case.
that these security, these code scanning tools are really
Dude,
not doing the full coverage of what they need to be doing? I mean, is
if you
what
spend
the
all your time addressing your SAST findings and you're a software company, good luck actually like shipping a product and having a profitable business.
so again, like maybe what we're seeing is the same problem that we have in vulnerability management is it's just the context isn't there. It's everything is a nail, the hammer is
Mhm.
here. So
Yeah,
in vuln management, the hammer is patching.
yeah,
In AppSec, the hammer is ask AI how to rewrite my code. Um, or it's a gate that prevents a critical or high from going to production. But are we actually looking for the right things? Are we asking the right questions? I think maybe demonstrably, like the answer is no. You know, if if the amount of application security tooling adoption is at an all-time high, and the trajectory of software CVEs is increasing, then perhaps we're not looking at the right things.
yeah. There's like some sort of like negative correlation going on there. And I actually I have a theory, and I don't know if it's right, but and I see this on like third-party software infrastructure CVs, but I've also seen it in AppSec, is you'll see these criticals. Hey, CVSS 9.8. Hey, we've got these vulnerabilities. They've been around for 6 months. They're killing our MTTR. We had that conversation, have that conversation 6 months later, really killing our MTTRs 12 months. And yet they haven't been exploited. The longer it goes unfixed and the longer the vulnerabilities are not exploited, the more in the minds of some asset owners, well, like that just proves it's not a risk.
Mm.
Hey, I've left my window open in my neighborhood at my house for the last 5 years. I've never had a break in. I live in a good neighborhood. Or the other defenses at my home are sufficient. It almost like validates not fixing it. And that starts to invalidate the whole like severity to patching
Yeah,
priority model and vulnerability management.
no, I
So
think you have. I think you have a point. It's we you get you almost get numb to it. Uh,
yeah.
Even though all the data points to the older vulnerabilities are more likely to be exploited.
Well,
0 days exist, sure, and we've seen them, and we've seen them exploited. But if you compare, what percentage of vulnerabilities get exploited more often or more frequently, it's the older ones.
yeah.
But I, I don't know. Like to your point about having a depressing conversation, like are we just running on a hamster wheel in security and the
Yeah.
volume of findings is what's funding all of like the security industry
Well, look,
for risky
here's a
incentives.
view that I have. I know I run a software company, right?
You better have zero critical findings in that
Hey,
software, Joe.
I don't like to brag, but we're SOC 2 compliant. Um, but here's what I would say, and this isn't true for Spektion because our vulnerability posture is amazing. But
Show me the reports.
yeah, but if every organization was as bad as their CVE numbers and MTTR, everyone would be breached all the time,
I agree.
right? And so that lack of direct correlation with I don't think that asset owners are just like irresponsible like leaders who don't want to patch, but they've got to maintain, they've got feature velocity, they've got like stability, and they've got security, and they've got to balance those. And when in their mind, they're not seeing a direct correlation between insecurity and the volume and MTTR of like high and critical CVEs, it's hard for them to justify like introducing, the potential for an outage or forcing app teams to wait a week before they roll a feature because they've got to go ahead and apply these patches first before that new, feature can go to like the test environment. So
Yeah,
like
it's kind of
that to
like
me is where the model is totally broken right now. Like I understand why like technology teams can't get aligned.
yeah, because they're kind of like you're telling me all this stuff is bad, but I've yet to see it be proven that it's bad. So I'm going to, you're asking me to interrupt our users or interrupt the, new release of a new feature in the application so I can fix something that theoretically might be exploited.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna go ahead here and just shill for like runtime vulnerability management
Do it.
and and behavioral insights, because I mean what you can do with behavioral insights is just go ahead and show, hey, this is insecure behavior right now that's happening in the software, right? We didn't take a piece of software, match it to a CPE, then say here's a CVE. Like it's too much connecting of the dots. But when you can say, hey, here we go, here is this software, it's executing on our systems, here's something it's doing insecurely. Like, hey, here we're seeing our software accept revoke certificates.
That's
Tell me
wild.
why that's okay. Why is it okay for us to have this software that's accepting revoke certificates? Right?
Yeah,
In what
right.
world is that business critical, right? Or is
Yeah,
that
and
acceptable?
that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Like these software companies, they're in the business of shipping software. They're not in the business of security.
Yeah. Let me this is gonna be the hardest question. I'll make it the last one that you have to answer. Uh when you think about just the next couple years as it relates to vulnerability management, what are you optimistic about? If you don't have a good answer, I'll cut this out.
Yeah, that's fine. I actually am optimistic, and I guess Gartner calls them CTEM solutions. I'm not optimistic about that market. I'm optimistic that we're finally coming around to saying, hey, wait, maybe there's more to vulnerability risk than just a CVE. Maybe context is important. Now, I don't think any of these vendors have gotten it right yet. What I am optimistic about is more context, more data around vulnerabilities, and it's not just a patch. What do these systems have access to? What are the layers of your compensating controls? What are the identities that are accessing these applications? What do those identities have access to? Putting all of that together, I'm starting to be more optimistic about vulnerability management. What I'm pessimistic about is that I hope that the industry comes around to realize that the wall or maybe the mountain of vulnerability debt that we've created of publishing all these CVEs, maybe we'll look ourselves in the mirror and say, you know what, maybe that wasn't the best way to articulate the risk. Maybe we need to have a little more context.
Well, there's a lot of investment in the CVE industrial complex, right? So you're right.
Well,
I'm a little pessimistic about that changing over time. I mean, changing quickly. I think it'll change over time, but there's a lot of forces at play, and there's a lot of money invested in that and a lot of legacy process.
yeah,
And I can just tell you, like as a CISO, if you've been building all your metrics around CVE and that's how you've been communicating everything, your successor can go ahead and do it differently, but you, in your role, it can be difficult to flip the script and change that narrative
yeah,
with the board and the executive team.
yeah, absolutely. Because they're going to look at you and say, "Wait, were you wrong the past 2, 3 years?"
So you just woke up and got smarter, Joe? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah. All right. Well, Kyle, thanks for joining, man. I appreciate it as always.
yeah.
Looking
Thank
forward to
you.
hearing more about what you do, as you really get things underway at Avid. And yeah, we'll talk again. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.